Well, last time we looked at how Roman cities worked, how the rich lived and the poor lived, and then we took a look at Roman marriages and Roman divorce. So basically how the husband was more or less in charge of everything, and the women really had no rights at all. And the husband could divorce his wife for pretty much any reason, and many of them did. I mean, especially the upper classes would just sort of divorce right and left so they could make more profitable matches. And it wasn't seen as a huge deal. And even among the Jews, divorce, even though the Old Testament says God hates divorce, divorce was actually still fairly common. So, any questions on marriage before we move on? Greek and Roman and Jewish marriage, not modern marriage, because I can't answer much about that. All right, so looking specifically now at the status of women, Greek society, specifically Greek society, was incredibly sexist. Even during like the classical period in Athens, which was the big, time of democracy and all that, even then, women really had very few civil liberties. Women couldn't vote. They couldn't hold property. They took no part whatsoever in civic affairs or politics or public entertainment. They couldn't compete in sporting events or even go to them. They couldn't go to the theater or anything like that.
Aaron, excuse me. Are you under the Greco-Roman culture under family?
Yes, still under family.
Okay. I'm sorry.
No. So women really were kept out of polite society. Public society was men only, if you were any kind of respectable woman. Marriages, as we talked about last time, were arranged by parents. Usually girls would be in their early teens. Husbands might be about 25 to 30 years old, because a husband was expected to be able to provide for his wife, and so he needed to be old enough to be established. But they wanted wives for children, so they wanted to marry them as soon as they were capable of having children. So, wives usually fairly young, husbands older. And the wife's main function, basically they're there solely to have children and manage the household. Greek women were very secluded. They were more or less just confined to the home. Like I said, they didn't take part in these sort of public events. They weren't seen out and about. Even when the husband entertained guests in the home, the woman was supposed to remain in the kitchen, barefoot and pregnant, more or less. And the kitchen was in the back of the house. So the woman was expected to stay in the kitchen in the back of the house while the husband was up front. And the only time the wife would come out would be to serve food and drinks. And then she had to go back. And this wasn't just, the wider culture. Even the great Greek thinkers and philosophers and statesmen pretty much all agreed that women were inferior and subordinate.
What did the men do until they were older 20s or whatever?
Well, they would go out, they'd have some of them would be educated, others would just be working a trade and just sort of building up enough funds and stability to be able to support a wife.
Was the family wanting them to stay at home longer to help support their mom and dad for a while?
Yeah, families usually, they have multiple generations in the same house sort of thing. So Socrates, for example, called women the weaker sex, and he actually said that to be born a woman was tantamount to a divine curse. So that's Socrates. Plato, again, thought that women were inferior, and he gave thanks that he was not born a woman or a barbarian. So to his mind, there really wasn't much difference between them. Xenophon, who was a famous statesman and historian, said that the ideal woman was one who whom you saw as little as possible, heard as little as possible, and one who asked as few questions as possible. Men, don't say anything. The famous Athenian statesman Pericles, who was sort of the great architect of Athenian democracy, he stated that it was the duty of an Athenian mother to live so retired a life that her name would never be mentioned among men, whether for praise or for shame. So basically, if you're a woman, you are not supposed to be known at all for any reason, good or bad, according to Pericles. Aristotle taught that a husband and wife functioned as a body, but definitely with the husband as the head. And then Demosthenes, another great Athenian statement, sort of summed up the Greek attitude toward women in a fairly famous quote, where he said, "We have courtesans for our pleasure, prostitutes, who are young female slaves, for daily physical use, and wives to bring up legitimate children and to be faithful stewards in household matters." So that was pretty much the Greek attitude. The wife was there just to have your kids and manage her household. If you wanted to do something fun, you went to a prostitute, or if you're a high class, to a courtesan, a hetiara, they were called.
So is this one of the things that made Christians so countercultural, was that they included women? And
Very much so. They included women. Even if women couldn't be elders, they had a lot of other positions of authority in the early church. And, again, husbands were told to love their wives and to only have relations with them and to have them, on a regular basis. So they were, women were raised up. They weren't to something much more equal to that of the husband among Christians. Now, that was traditional Greek society. Roman society wasn't as bad. We've already talked a bit about how Roman wives could actually wield a significant amount of power if the household was fairly large, even if they weren't really supposed to be out either. But women were allowed to attend public functions. They were allowed to walk the streets unattended. And women, Roman women, could actually inherit property and initiate divorce. Remember, even in Jewish society, only the men could initiate divorce. A woman was more or less at the mercy of her husband. But in Roman society, a woman could initiate divorce. But they had no role in politics. They couldn't vote. And they were not entitled on their own to the free distribution of bread that Roman politicians would give out in order to sort of win favor from the people. So, they could get bread for their household, for their husband, but on their own, they were not entitled to go and get free bread. And the Roman attitude toward wives wasn't that different than that of the Greeks, in that they thought that women were just there for sex and for children and to keep the house. And as I mentioned before, it was considered more ideal, more properly Roman to sleep with your female slaves and with prostitutes, and to spare your wife, your desires, your lusts, basically. The wife was just supposed to be there for the kids, to have children. Now, questions so far? Other comments? So in Greco-Roman religion, it wasn't much better. Women were excluded from a lot of religious ceremonies. They were usually prohibited from worshiping in temples with men. And, of course, many women were used as temple prostitutes. There are very few religions that had priestesses, and even the ones that did, the priestesses were definitely of a lower rank than the male priests. There are, various myths in the Christian, that there were these pagan religions where women were all powerful and they were seen as the spiritual ones and all that, but that's not really true. Even among the religions, the temples for the various goddesses, the men were still seen as the superior ones to women. The priests were still head of the priestesses. There wasn't really a Greco-Roman religion where the priestesses were supreme. And of course, Jewish writers also saw the wife as subservient. Josephus said that the woman, says the law, meaning the Mosaic law, or what he saw as the Mosaic law, is in all things inferior to the man. Let her accordingly be submissive, not for her humiliation, but that she may be directed, for the authority has been given by God to the man. So that's what Josephus wrote. Back a few sessions ago, before the break, I read some passages from the Apocrypha that also talked about sort of the very low view that Jews had of women at the time. Now, Jewish women weren't quite as isolated as Greco-Roman women. They did seem to have more dealings with the public. Think of, they would go out and do things like draw water from the well and that sort of thing. So they could be out and about. But they actually had less legal freedom. Roman society at least gave women more legal rights. The ideal for a Jewish wife was silence, seclusion, and modesty. She wasn't expected to have any friends or religious views of her own. She was just supposed to share her husband's social circle and views. So in a lot of ways, even among the Jews, women were sort of treated as chattel. A woman could be given in marriage by her father, could be sold as a slave by her father. She always had to live under the guardianship of a male. But it does appear that at least women did not seem to have been seen as property in the same way that slaves were. So that was definitely the effect of the Mosaic law, because that, even though it wasn't to the lengths that Christian ideas would come, the Mosaic law had still done a lot to elevate women. And even with the corruption of how people saw that law and other influences, that still seemed to have kept Jewish women at a slightly higher status. But of course, women weren't seen as reliable testimonies in court. They weren't supposed to, follow rabbis or anything like that. So they were still very much second class. Which, of course, is why it's such a big deal that the first people who saw Jesus rise from the dead were women, and they were the ones who went and told the disciples. Because this would have been seen as almost scandalous to most people of the day, that the first Christian witnesses were women.
That's also one of the reasons why we don't believe the Bible's made up, right? Because it has embarrassing things like...
Yeah, that's not anything anybody would have made up. No one would have said that Mary Magdalene was the first person to see Jesus after the resurrection if they've been, trying to make up a good story. Now, children were basically ruled over by their father like he was just an absolute monarch. Since they were given life by their parents, they were expected to honor and obey them. Essentially, children were seen as having a debt to their parents that they could never repay. In a lot of ways, the parent-child relationship was very similar to the patron-client relationship, which we'll talk about probably later today. But they were seen as being in debt to their parents. Roman fathers even had authority over their married sons until the fathers died. So the patriarch of the family still maintained absolute authority even after his children were married. Now, at least for the sons. The daughters, if they went and lived with their husband, would have been under the authority of their husband and not the father. But the sons still stayed under their father's authority until the father died. Children were seen as reflecting their parents. 4th Maccabees 15:4 says that children possessed a wondrous likeness both of mind and form to their parents. So children were very much seen as a reflection of their parents. And because of that, the behavior of the children reflected on that. So a child's behavior could severely shame not only him, but his parents as well, and harm the family honor, which was, the worst possible thing you could do. This is why it was so harsh for Jesus to call the Pharisees the sons of the devil, and to say that their father was the devil, that they were, of the father of lies, because that was, saying that by saying the devil was their parent, he was saying you take after the devil. Your actions are like that of the devil. And of course, because of all this, families were very capable of exerting tremendous pressure on any of their members who might leave the family religion and the family values. So this was something that early Christians would face a lot of. They would face tremendous pressure from their families if they left their pagan religion or if they left Judaism and became Christian. And this would go as extreme as disowning a child or divorcing a spouse who became a Christian. And again, this was seen as necessary and right to the society at large, because only by those kind of extreme actions could the family be saved from that level of dishonor of their child abandoning their values. And of course, Jesus predicted this. He said that people would have to leave brothers or sisters or fathers or mothers or children. He said he would come to divide, father from son and husband from wife. And this is the sort of thing he was talking about. And this is one reason there was so great an emphasis on the church as a family. Because for a lot of these people, the church was the only family they had left. And instead of being under the authority of their earthly father, they were now under the authority of their heavenly Father. Questions? So a bit about education. There was education back then. People, almost everyone had some. Most children would have been educated in the home, and most children would have been given some grasp of reading, writing, and counting. Maybe not to the level of full literacy, but they wouldn't have been completely illiterate and completely unable to do things like basic arithmetic, because any tradesman had to be able to do basic math just to keep track of everything. So children would be taught that. They would need to know at least some reading and writing. But again, this was usually done in the home. All children at first were educated by their mother. Now, when the sons became around 5 or 6, they would move on to being educated by their father in things like the family business and, crafts and trade and whatever it was the father did, that's what they would be educated in. Girls would continue to be taught by their mother and basically just taught whatever they needed to know to be married. They didn't need to know anything greater than that. They certainly weren't getting lessons and, any sort of higher level thinking or anything like that. They were just being taught to be wives. Now, among both Jews and Romans, education included religious education. So Jewish children would learn to read and write and read the Tanakh, the Old Testament, and the like. They would memorize large portions of it. And Romans, would be educated, in Roman mythology, Roman religion, their household gods, and the like. Now, the children of Roman citizens were able to go to public schools for more advanced education. Now, not all of them did this. If you were a poorer family, you couldn't afford to have your child go off even and be educated because you needed them at home. You needed them to work. But richer, more affluent households that, had slaves and the like to do the work could send their children off to be educated. And this was the goal of such education was usually to produce the next generation of statesmen. They wanted to produce, politicians and the like. So they would be trained in rhetoric or speaking well, composition or writing well, not just writing nicely, but like composing, speeches and the like well. And they'd be trained in classical philosophy, and a lot of that being political philosophy. They would also exercise a good bit. They would exercise their body. They would also exercise the voice so that they could be a good orator, so that they could speak. Because, again, the goal was to be a politician. Upper-class Jewish children would attend advanced Torah schools, much like, not too different from the way a lot of Jewish children go to yeshiva nowadays, which is a religious school. They would learn argumentation, how to study the law, how to argue the law. They will learn communication and the like. So basically, upper-class Jewish children would be taught essentially to become something like a rabbi or an official in the local synagogue. Now, in the first century, in the time of Jesus in the early church, the literacy rate in the empire was probably about 10 to 15%. Again, everyone probably knew a little bit, but like full literacy, where you had a good command of the language, you can read and write pretty much anything, that was about 10 to 15% overall. Now, it's likely that among Jews that level was higher, maybe significantly higher. Jewish boys and girls, to some extent, needed to know how to read the scriptures, both so that they could teach them to their children and so that they could participate in the synagogue. Josephus claimed that literacy rate in first century Jews was around 90%, but Josephus exaggerates a lot. So it probably wasn't that high. But it almost certainly was higher than the empire at large. And you'll have people, even nowadays, claiming that there's no way that the Gospels could have been written by the traditional authors, because how would a Jewish fisherman or someone like that know how to write? Well, most of them probably did, to some extent. Questions? So a little bit about just how Greek and Roman houses were set up, because houses were very important, not only as where families lived, but also because that's where they conducted their businesses. So Greek and Roman houses were built sort of similar. They weren't identical, but they had a lot of similar features. They would have been more or less shaped like a square and arranged around an inner courtyard called the atrium, which was partially covered. And then the separate rooms of the house would all open up into the atrium. So you wouldn't really have hallways, enclosed hallways. You'd have that center courtyard and then the different rooms opening up from that. Some rooms were reserved for private family use, but much of the house was intended for entertaining and for production, for, producing goods for the family business. So your typical house was both a residence and a place of business. So much of the house was intended for public use, not private. Roman households would produce instead of just consume. So they were consumers. People weren't self-sufficient, but everyone produced something. Even the Apostle Paul was a tent maker. So most families had some kind of trade. Members of the household would work together in a trade or a craft to provide income. Again, a household was not just immediate family, not just the nuclear family of parents and children, but also extended relatives, household slaves, employees, even guests at times. So these would all work together for the family business. And one room of the house would usually be open to the street as a shop. So, the front room of your house, whatever room opened onto the street, that was more or less your shop front. Now, upper class households, the ones who didn't really have to worry about having trade because they were aristocrats, they had independent sources of income. The home was seen as a space for networking. This is where you had important people over for parties and the like to network with. The income would come from the country estates. If you were an aristocrat, you would have your nice house in the city, and then you'd have the country estates with all your slaves that were basically farming or whatever, and that would produce your income. Not in a way, not too different from like feudal society. Now, Greek houses could be a little bit different. The dining room in a Greek house, which was known as the andron, A-N-D-R-O-N, the andron, which literally means the place of men. Andros meaning man, so the andron is the place of men. So that was the dining room, because remember, in Greek society, the woman stayed out of sight in the kitchen. She wasn't out dining with the men. So the dining room was the place of men. It oftentimes had a raised floor for dining couches, because people, especially higher class people, wouldn't sit up to eat. They'd recline on a couch, which to me always seems like a huge hassle. But again, if you're wealthy, that was a way of showing off your wealth. You could eat in a very impractical fashion because you weren't in a rush. You didn't have to go and, take care of business. So you'd have dining couches along the sides around the central table. The Roman equivalent was what's called the triclinium, which had 3 dining couches, tri meaning 3. And a Greek house would usually also have a large living room spanning one complete side of the house, and that's where guests would be received. So Greek and Roman houses were very much the center of people's lives. Again, it wasn't just where you lived, it was where you worked. And everything was very much centered around your home. Questions?
Did they grow a lot of their food?
Not in the city.
Yeah.
I mean, you get food brought in from the countryside. So the rich, again, the wealthy would own estates in the countryside and produce food, and that would be brought in and sold. Earlier in Roman history, you'd have much more of the sort of independent small farmer. That was seen as sort of the backbone of Roman society. But by this point in time, that a lot of the land was taken up by wealthy estates.
Would a wealthy house would you be able to recognize it just from sight, or would it just like?
They'd be very big and fancy. So a lot of the poor people, if you were really poor in Rome, you lived in what we would nowadays call an apartment. If having a house at all was for someone who was well-to-do enough to be running their own business and all of that. And the really poor usually didn't work. You might work for someone else as an employee, but many of them didn't work at all. And they would just get food. They would get handouts. The government would give them food. And a lot of them just lived that way. And that's how politicians would sort of buy favor, is providing, bread for the masses. Anything else?
Back then, I assume they didn't have plumbing, running water.
No, we talked about this last week. They did. There was running water for, the wealthy.
Not in the apartments.
Not the insulae, not in the apartments. But if the bigger, the wealthier houses, yes, they had running water. They had a sewer system. They actually lived pretty luxuriously.
Weren't the Romans the ones that built all these fantastic water systems?
Oh yeah, that's all the aqueducts, all the sewer systems, the pipe, all that was all Roman. Now all their pipes were made out of lead, so in fact that's where we get the word plumbing. The Latin word for lead is plumbum. So there is definitely some speculation that the decline of the empire might have come from like lead poisoning. That might have been a factor. There was people, they used lead for plumbing, they used lead for makeup, they used lead everywhere. But yeah, they had a fairly sophisticated, water system. Anything else? Okay, so let's take a look at the patron and client system, because this is really the heart of the Roman social and business world. And you actually see a lot of patron-client language in the New Testament, and you don't recognize it, but it permeates the New Testament, this idea of the patron-client relationship. And the thing is, to us, the patron-client relationship would look like nepotism. It would look like favoritism. Because essentially the basic idea was, it was all who you knew. If you wanted to get ahead in Roman society, or if you needed someone even to support you, it was all about who you knew. And in fact, the patron-client relationship is the main way that our relationship with God is portrayed in the Old Testament. I mean, we tend to think of it as being more like the father-child relationship, but you actually see a lot more patron-client language than you do family language when it comes to our relationship with God. So the way it worked was this. So basically, in Roman society, property, wealth, and goods were concentrated in the hands of a few, of the wealthy. They pretty much owned and controlled everything. So if you were a member of the lower classes and you needed financial help to start a business, or if you needed a safety net after your business failed, if you needed protection from someone who want your property, if you needed debt relief, if you needed political favors, or if you were after a certain political position, or anything like that, basically what you would do is you would go to someone who held a higher social rank than you did. And you would ask them for a favor. You would petition them for a favor for them to basically supply what you needed. And if this petition was granted, it would open up a long-term relationship between the one who granted the favor, who is the patron, and the one who received the favor, who was the client. So David de Silva, who wrote the book Honor, Patronage, Kinship, and Purity, which I have put in the church library, it's a phenomenal introduction to a lot of this, said that this relationship would be marked by the mutual exchange of desired goods and services, the patron being available for assistance in the future, the client doing everything in his or her power to enhance the fame and honor of the patron. The client would publicize the benefit in showing the patron respect, and he would remain loyal to the patron and provide services whenever the opportunity arose. So basically, the patron would provide for the client, and the client would be there to, provide what he could for the patron, and also to increase the patron's fame and honor. He would glorify the patron. He would give him honor. He would give him glory. So this interaction wasn't a contract relationship. This wasn't something you sat down and you had like an ironclad list of duties for each one that you signed off on, and no one was expected to go beyond it. It was a relationship, and it was as fluid as a relationship usually is. So the patron would essentially treat the client as part of his family. In other words, so he would take responsibility for the client's well-being, just in general. The client would in return make himself available to serve the patron in whatever means the patron needed. So again, there was no set list of rules. It was just, the patron needed something, he would tell the client would do what he could to serve him. And this was done out of gratitude. Again, it wasn't like there was no salary or anything. This was supposed to be done out of gratitude for the favor that the patron had provided. So the patron's contribution, whatever he gave to the client to start off the relationship, whether it was money or whether it was an introduction to someone the patron needed to know, whether it was political position, whatever the patron had done, this favor was seen as an unmerited thing. The client didn't earn the favor. The patron provided it theoretically freely. And the client was seen as never truly being able to repay it. because there's no way, a poor person can repay the favor from a wealthy person.
But would it be like, would people do this a lot just so that they would have somebody?
Yes, this was a lot of people, if not most people, were on one side or the other of this, or sometimes both sides, depending.
At one time or another.
Yeah. If you were like rich, you would have your clients, but then you would probably also be the client of someone wealthier and of higher status than you. So it was a whole web of relationships stretching throughout Roman society. Again, this was the glue that held Roman society together.
It's so hard for us to wrap our heads around it.
Yeah, it's so different than anything we're used to.
Explained this to me before, and I definitely can see it in the Bible. I mean, I can see it, but it's just for us with contracts and paying people and employees and here's your responsibilities. It's just so foreign to us.
So the Greek word for the favor bestowed by the patron was charis. And in the New Testament, the word charis is translated as mercy. So when you hear about God's mercy or God's grace, it's very similar concepts. This is the picture that they're drawing from. This is God's unmerited favor to us. God is our client. He is providing us with charis that we cannot repay. And we serve him out of gratitude, not out of attempting to earn the favor, but out of gratitude for having been given it.
Eric, God would be our
patron.
No,
Yes.
No,
we are God's clients.
Charis is
Charis. Charis. Yes. So again, in return for the favor, the client would serve the patron in whatever way needed as an expression of his eternal gratitude. So this service was referred to as the client expressing pistis. 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 And this is the word that is in the New Testament is translated as faith or faithfulness. So we are expected to keep pistis with God, to keep faithful to God in the same fashion. And this was also actually seen as a form of grace. This was seen as replying grace with grace. So again, it was in a way it was a mutual relationship. But the patron was definitely seen as above the client. So the patron would give the client grace, and the client would respond with faithfulness. So again, you can start to see how this is very much the picture that is being drawn from for our relationship with God. This is how Paul especially was explaining to Greco-Roman people, where this was a part of their culture. This is how he's explaining this is what your relationship with God is. And you can also see why it was such a big deal that people shouldn't try to earn God's grace, because it cannot be earned in the same way that the client can never earn the favor. All he can do is accept it and promise service in return. Now,
What happens if you don't want to promise service?
Well, the patron doesn't have to accept you. I mean, it was expected. If you accepted a favor from a patron and didn't serve him in return, you would lose all your honor. You would be completely shamed and probably pretty much an outcast in Roman society, because you can't have people doing that or the whole system would fall apart. So now sometimes the grace extended by the patron took the form of an introduction of the client to an even higher ranking benefactor. There's accounts of this in Roman writings of fairly famous people introducing, like you might have a fairly well-known Roman statesman who has a friend who asks him for an introduction to the emperor, and he provides that, and that is seen as a patron serving a client. So If the client was requesting something the patron couldn't supply, the patron could introduce him to a higher ranking patron who was able to supply the favor. And then the go-between was referred to as a mediator, and the higher ranking patron would take on his client based on his relationship with the mediator. So the higher ranking patron might not know the low ranking client, but based on his relationship with the mediator, the middle person, he would take this person on. And this would increase the honor of both the patron and the mediator. Again, this is all using honor basically as currency. Patrons would take people on because they would increase their honor by doing so. And, sometimes this type of relationship would exist between people of equal status, in which case they would call each other their friend. And friend doesn't mean their buddy they hang out with. This was, what you called your same status person that you were nonetheless acting as a patron to. They would call each other friends. Now, a patron would also refer to his lower ranking clients as his friends. And this would be seen as a face-saving measure to the lower ranking person. By the patron calling the client his friend, he's not basically rubbing their relationship in his face. He's saying that, yes, you are lower ranking than I am, but I am going to be gracious and ignore that and call you my friend. But the client would never call his patron his friend. His patron, that would have been incredibly presumptuous. So again, think about how we are called friends of God. God is calling us his friends, and because he is taking us on as his clients and giving us charis. But we have to be careful. We are friends of God, but we can't be presumptuous in thinking that our relationship with God is on that equal level. Now, again, theoretically, the favor of the patron was extended purely out of benevolence, with no expectation of return, as it was known that the client could never really pay it back. Now, here's where we get into the ideal. This is the way everything was theoretically supposed to work. The patron was supposed to take on the client. He was supposed to provide a favor purely out of the goodness of his heart that the client couldn't repay. But it was absolutely expected of the client to repay this grace with faithfulness, and there was nothing more dishonorable for a client than to break faith with his patron. And so a client was expected to always be looking for a way to repay the grace of the patron and give him honor. So again, this wasn't a one and done type of deal. This was a long-term relationship where, the patron is supposed to be continually looking out for the well-being of his client. The client is continually looking for ways to honor and glorify his patron. So the upshot of all of this is that there was no such thing as a free gift in the ancient world. Gifts came with strings. By accepting a gift, you are entering into a patron-client relationship with all the expected responsibilities. Now apply this to when Paul is talking about receiving gifts from these different churches and how he's always so insistent that the gifts to him are actually gifts from God. That he doesn't need anything, that by giving him this gift, you're giving him a gift from God. And, that is at least in part because Paul is very graciously avoiding a patron-client relationship with the people giving him gifts. He's basically saying, yes, church of wherever, you have given me this gift, but that does not put me in obligation to you because this gift is really a gift to God. Because, Paul simply was not in a position to be anybody's client. He couldn't be beholden to anyone like that. And this is also why he would, while saying that, a worker is worthy of his wages and that people should be compensated for preaching the gospel, he would always make it a point to earn his own living whenever possible. Because, again, he wanted to maintain that independence. That was absolutely necessary. Yeah. He couldn't be owned by anyone. He had to serve God and God alone. Questions?
Now, is this also with the whole praise, how you...
Praise, yes. We praise God as a means of giving him honor, of expressing our gratitude for his favor.
Wouldn't the client go around and talk
Yes.
about his patron, tell
Yeah.
other people how wonderful the patron was, and
Yes.
and so when we see that in the Bible, where we're supposed to be praising God and giving him honor, and that would be similar to what they were doing.
So I know this is kind of hard for us to kind of wrap our minds around. So in the book Misreading Scripture with Western Eyes, which I have put in the church library, the authors give us a sort of picture. This is not a true story. This is a story they invented to illustrate the patron-client relationship, sort of an idea of how this would go. So they say, imagine a young baker named Marcus in the town of Philippi. Marcus learned to bake bread from his father. The family business stretched back to the founding of Philippi 5 generations back. Marcus's family was, consequently, one of the founding members of the Bakers Guild. 100 years ago, his ancestor had retired from the Roman army. He had baked bread for the army of Octavius Augustus during the glorious victory over Antony. As a reward, his family, which had originated in the province of Lydia in ancient Minor, had been given Roman citizenship and land in Philippi. He had a true tripartite Roman name, Marcus Augustus Lydia. When his father was young, Vesta, the goddess of fire and the protector of bakers, became angry, and a fire destroyed the family bakery. Marcus's father went to a wealthy widow, a cloth merchant who was also from the province of Lydia, because you had that connection, to seek help. Julia Lydia loaned his father the money to rebuild the bakery. Thus began an enduring relationship. Today, Marcus sells all his bread to Lydia, including all the members of her extended household, which covers an entire city block of Philippi, plus all her other friends, the various merchants with whom Lydia does business. So as part of the relationship, he received a favor from Lydia. Now his business basically exists to supply her and her connections with bread. These customers give Marcus all the business he and his young sons can handle. He sells his bread at a reasonable price, and his family makes a good, though modest, living. Lydia ensures that no one takes advantage of anyone else. 3 years ago, the barley sellers raised their prices. All the bakers panicked. Naturally, Marcus asked his patroness to help. She invited the patron of the barley merchants to dinner. During a civilized meal, Lydia mentioned how her friend Marcus and his difficult living situation. The two patrons discussed how they could best help their friends, arriving at a fair price for barley flour. This trade negotiation, disguised as a dinner discussion, was a binding trade agreement. Lydia did what was appropriate as the patron of Marcus the baker. Again, to us, this would seem like backroom dealing, but this is how it was handled in Roman culture. Of course, such relationships were two-sided. Last year, one of Lydia's slaves awakened Marcus in the middle of the night. Lydia needed a favor. She had received special guests, and she was planning an elaborate dinner party for some wealthy families of Philippi, for which she needed special bread to serve at this important banquet. The guests had brought a letter that she planned to have read to the group. She needed Marcus to cook something special. How could he refuse his patroness? It took all night, but he made sure the bread was ready. The rules for what was expected of a patron and a client were not painted on Roman city walls. Political slogans were, and other graffiti. The rules for the truly foundational institutions of society, like family and patronage, went without being said. Everyone knew what the proper behavior was. A good patron solved the problems of his or her clients, assisting with trade guilds, business disputes, refinancing loans, and easing tensions with city elders. Ordinary folk like Marcus had neither the clout nor the social graces to negotiate such endeavors. The patron did favors for his clients, who then fell under his circle of influence and protection. In return, the client was expected to be loyal, faithful, and was sometimes asked to do things for the patron. And again, all comes from misreading Scripture with Western eyes. So that's sort of a picture of just give you some idea of how the patron-client relationship worked. Again, it's all unwritten rules. There's no formal contracts here. Everyone's just sort of expected to know where they fall into the system. In a way, the best example of this to modern Western minds is something like The Godfather. This is like how mafia works. But where do they come from? Italy. The mafia system is almost a direct descendant of the old Roman patron-client system. So it's that same sort of idea is, you don't have unwritten rules, but you better not break the rules. Questions?
Can you get married if you're a client?
Yes, I mean almost everyone was a patron or client. So yes, I'm sure you were probably expected to, so that you could have a family and continue the relationship.
So the relationship continues.
Mm-hmm. At least until the death of the patron. I don't know if it would have continued on with the families or not, but certainly it was a long-term, if not lifelong, relationship. Other questions? All right, so next time we will take a look at Roman religion and superstition and how and the mystery cults and how all that sort of thing worked out.